Hello and welcome to part two of this lecture on the nervous system, introductory lecture on the nervous system. These lectures, three of them are designed for my anatomy class, ninth grade anatomy class, but hopefully anyone who's in anatomy or working on the nervous system, you can get some benefit from these, and this would be of some assistance and help to you in understanding this complicated system of the body. So we're going to pick up now with the brain, and we're going to look at the major portions of the brain and then move on from there and talk about the different divisions of the nervous system. So the cerebellum, it literally means little brain. And what is the cerebellum mainly involved in? It's involved in coordination, equilibrium, and balance. So we're talking about the coordination of our muscles and making our muscles work in the ways that we want them to. Equilibrium and balance, and maintaining our balance and understanding where we are in terms of the space that we're in. And we call those spatial relationships. So the cerebellum helps with that. This is where the center of our muscle tone is, and I don't mean muscle tone like you're working out and you got great muscle tone. Muscle tone is a condition where your muscle tissue, the skeletal muscles, are always partially contracted. So in order for us to sit upright or to maintain our posture, we have to have muscle tone. There have to be muscles that are continually being contracted. And so the cerebellum is where that's controlled. So our ability to be able to sit upright and not slump down in our seats, or our ability to stand upright and have upright posture, that's due to the cerebellum maintaining that muscle tone. So which muscles should be contracted in order to enable us to have some type of posture. Now the cerebellum is only about 10% of the brain volume, but it contains more neurons than the rest of the brain combined. So you take the brain stem and the cerebrum, the remaining 90%, and the cerebellum has more neurons than all the other brain tissue combined. So there must be so much going on in the cerebellum, a lot of which we don't know. So there's still tons of research that needs to be done in regard to the cerebellum and understanding better how it functions, what its role is, and what does it do for us overall. We know these functions here, obviously, but there has to be more that is still yet unknown about the cerebellum. So it's an interesting part of the brain. Lots of research can be done regarding the cerebellum. It's the fastest working part of the brain. Because it has all these neurons within it, it's able to function so fast, so quickly. And it's capable of making decisions, and I kind of use that word loosely in quotes, you could say, making decisions based on previous experiences. It has what we call muscle memory in it. So you learn how to ride a bike, for example, whenever you were younger. And then let's say you rode during your childhood years, and then you got your driver's license and you didn't really get into bike riding anymore after that. And then 20 years later, somebody says, hey, let's go for a bike ride. It's not like you have to learn how to do that again. Now, the cerebrum is involved in this as well, where you have the memory of riding a bike and the ability to do it. But the muscle memory and the functioning of it, because you rode your bike for years when you were a child, and you rode it for miles and miles, but all that information is no longer needed to be stored in the cerebrum. And I'm simplifying this very much, but this is kind of how it works in a general way, where when you're first learning how to ride a bike, your cerebrum is heavily involved because you're trying to figure out where to put your feet, how to maintain your balance, how to spin the pedals, how to operate the brake. There's so many different aspects of learning how to ride a bike, and you have to think about that. So the cerebrum is heavily involved when you're first learning, but then after a year or two of riding, you do it almost mindlessly. You just hop on your bike and you go. Well, how are we able to do that? We don't have to go through this whole learning process again, because that information has been moved from the cerebrum and stored now in the cerebellum. And it's able to do that and store all this information because of the number of neurons that are there. So its storage capacity is enormous because of that. So, like I was saying, you learn how to ride a bike, you get your driver's license, you don't ride for decades, and then your friend says, hey, let's go ride a bike. And it's not like your friend has to be, okay, now we got to put training wheels on your bike, you have to learn where to put your feet. It's not like you have to relearn it again. You just get on the bike and you go. Well, why are we able to do that? Because that information has been stored, at least in terms of how our muscles work to ride a bike, that information has been stored in the cerebellum. And so we have muscle memory in there. Or you think of sports, like for example, running a play in football. Your coach has you run the play again and again and again until you get the play right. Or how to do a layup properly in basketball, for example. And your coach has you run a layup again and again and again so you do it properly. Well, why does your coach have you do that? Because maybe your coach knows, I don't know. But what's happening here is that you're practicing it again and again and again. And so that muscle memory gets stored in your cerebellum so that whenever it's game time, you can run the play almost without consciously thinking about it. You hear the play, you know what it is, and then you kind of go into this like this auto mode where you run the play, you know exactly how far up the field to run, you know when to cut to the left or when to cut to the right. If you're a receiver, you know when to look for the ball because you have run that play so many times. And so you don't have to think about where you are on the field, you just kind of know it because of your muscle memory. We do this all the time when we practice. Practice makes perfect. And the reason why that's happening is because this muscle memory is occurring within the cerebellum. And then you don't have to devote so much of your effort into understanding the play or where am I supposed to be or who's around me. You just run it automatically and it's done. And then you hopefully catch the football, you make the basket, or whatever it happens to be. So previous experiences get stored there. So practice. Yeah, you may hate doing it over and over again, but guess what? That's going to make you better on the field or on the court or whatever you happen to be doing. If you're dancing or where to put your fingers when you're playing the flute, for example, or the trumpet, you just memorize it. Or playing the piano, you know where your fingers are supposed to be at that particular moment because you've practiced that piece of music over and over and over again. It enables the rest of the brain to work more efficiently because it can carry out tasks quickly without conscious thought. And I have in parentheses there speech. We can say these things. I didn't rehearse this ahead of time. I don't have a script that I'm following, but I know what this particular slide is about, and I know what to say in regard to these facts about the cerebellum. And so the words just kind of come. And I speak them, and hopefully you're learning from them. And so this is all carried out without conscious thought. The unfixed brain, if you Google that, you can get on YouTube and type in the unfixed brain. It's just a neuroscientist, and she's holding a brain. She's a professor, and she talks about a brain that just came out of a recently deceased person. It's at an autopsy. So it's interesting to actually see the brain that is unfixed, meaning it hasn't been preserved in any kind of formalin or formaldehyde, and it's you know what do I say? It's fresh out of a person. Unfortunately, a person had died, and she took this opportunity to show us what the brain looks like right out of the cranium. The cerebrum literally means brain, and it's the only part of the brain involved in consciousness, meaning we know what's going on. We're aware of what's happening. It's the largest part of the brain, and it's divided into two, and I'm sure you've heard this term before, two hemispheres. Hemi meaning half, so half spheres. And the brain is kind of spherical, I guess. And so it's divided into hemispheres. And it has a line, a very deep fissure is what it's called, a deep groove in the middle, and that's called the central sulcus. And that divides the hemispheres in half. The outermost layer, the superficial layer, is called the cortex, which is highly folded. It's got many ridges and depressions in it and going up and down and up and down. That increases, and this is such an important aspect of biological systems and anatomy of biological organs, it increases surface area. So rather than being a flat surface, our brain has these deep grooves in it called sulci and these ridges in it that are called gyri. And some of these sulci are very deep, and so they're called fissures, and they go deeper into the brain tissue. So that's going to increase surface area as opposed to having a cortex that was just smooth with no depressions and ridges on it at all. Our heads would have to be enormous to accommodate our giant brain as a result of having no depressions or ridges on it. The neocortex. Neo means new, and so it's called the neocortex because this supposedly was the part of the cerebrum that formed most recently and gave higher intelligence found only in mammals. So mammals have what's called a neocortex on top of the cortex. It contains 4 distinct areas called lobes, which you can see in this graphic here colored for us. We have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And those same lobes would be on the other hemisphere of the brain as well. All 4 of these lobes would be present. And we divide up the brain, and you can see how it runs along those, especially between, like, for example, the frontal and the parietal and the temporal. There are deep fissures there, deep sulci, that kind of divide it up into those regions. And then we kind of mapped out the brain according to these lobes about what happens and what occurs in those lobes of the brain. Where is your logic center? Where is the memory center, the auditory center, the vision center? And so we divided it up into these lobes. And we figured this out through EEGs, electroencephalograms. And so we found out that different parts of the brain were active when they were taking in different senses. And so brain mapping has come about as a result of decades and decades of research. And then dividing the brain up into these quadrants, these regions that we call lobes. Where these processes are occurring. And by the way, in this picture here, if you look down below, right underneath the occipital and temporal lobe, the blue and the green areas, that larger bump with the lines on it, that's the cerebellum. And then in front of the cerebellum, you see the little bump immediately under the temporal lobe, that's the pons. And then straight down from the pons, that would be the medulla, and then heading down into the spinal cord. Deeper in the brain, the hypothalamus, hypo means below, so it's below a region of the brain called the thalamus. It's the hypothalamus. It maintains homeostasis, and that's its big function, keeping things at an even keel throughout the body. Homeostasis. Homeostasis means similar standing. So things are staying pretty much the same. It's the center for hunger, for thirst, for our emotions, for our body temperature, and what are called circadian rhythms. Sometimes you hear pronounced circadian rhythms, or if somebody really wants to get Latin on you, they would pronounce it circadian rhythms as well. So different ways. Circadian is probably the most common pronunciation for it. We'll talk about circadian rhythms in a minute. The hypothalamus is connected to the autonomic nervous system, and autonomic means, think of it being automatic, things that occur automatically within us involuntarily. It controls the pituitary gland, which makes it a link to the endocrine system, because the pituitary gland is what controls the endocrine system, and the pituitary is controlled by the hypothalamus. So this links the nervous system to the endocrine system. And then the thalamus is where sensory and motor functions, so our 5 senses and also our ability to move and control muscles, skeletal muscles, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. It's the last relay site before information reaches the cerebrum. And it organizes the information and sends it to appropriate areas of the cerebrum. So the thalamus is, kind of think of it like, if you think of the brain as a ball, the cerebrum, the thalamus would be kind of like near the center of it. And then it sends that information to the different lobes so that information can be processed properly by the cerebrum. This is just an image, one that I got. I Googled image circadian rhythms, and this one came up, and it was kind of an interesting one. And if you look at it briefly, it just talks about in a typical day of somebody who has what we would call, I guess, a regular sleep pattern where they sleep during the nighttime hours and they're awake during the daytime. But if you're working third shift, of course, this does not apply to you because you're awake at night and you sleep during the day. But this is giving this is a very generalized circadian rhythm picture because everybody is different. But if you Google image circadian rhythms, you can see how we have these times when we have hormone secretions at a particular time, we're sleepy at a particular time, and so forth. It's just kind of interesting. We all develop our own circadian rhythms, and it depends on when we wake up. Of course, in the summertime, whenever we're not in school, or during now when we're in quarantine, our circadian rhythms are different than, say, during our regular school cycle when we're waking up at 6 in the morning and going to bed maybe earlier than we are right now or during the summertime. So circadian rhythms can vary and they can change. And you can train your body and you adjust to it and you accommodate to new time patterns when you're awake and when you're asleep. So this is not something that stays the same. It shifts depending on your activity. This is a picture of a cadaver that was cut in half, and you can see what the brain looks like. It's an interesting picture. It shows the anatomy of the brain, and I just labeled a variety of parts. And so what we're talking about is the cerebrum, which you can see at the top left. The corpus callosum is kind of like the connecting bridge between the hemispheres. We talked about the hypothalamus and the thalamus, and you can see those two. The thalamus kind of sits under the corpus callosum, and then the hypothalamus sits underneath the thalamus. And then you can see the close proximity of the pituitary gland and its relationship to the hypothalamus. So you can see how there's a connection between those two. Then the cerebellum, the medulla, and then the spinal cord running down. So this is just to give you points of reference. Where are these parts of the brain? And hopefully this gives you a better understanding of the anatomy of it and where we are in the location of the brain. There's a region of the brain, a region of the cerebrum called the limbic system, and it includes portions of the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the cerebrum. So this is kind of deep within the cerebrum, and two main parts that I want to look at are the amygdala and the hippocampus. The amygdala is a center of, and they both are in terms of memory. The amygdala, that we have memory processes that are going on in there, emotions and fear as well. And so this is the part of the brain that can save our lives, for example, when we understand that we are in a situation where we need to get the heck out of there. And so this will help us interpret that and process that this is a situation that we need to fear and get away from. Hippocampus is involved in memory and learning. So like what you're doing now, and hopefully what you're doing now is learning something, this part of the brain would be pretty active right now because you're trying to absorb this information and learn more about the nervous system. In terms of memory, it converts short-term memories into long-term memories. And so with memory, if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. And so with the hippocampus, we can take this information that when we first hear it, it's just a short-term memory. But if we hear it again and again, or we study it more and we read more about it, that short-term information, those short-term memories, can be converted into long-term memories. And then we can keep those stored there for years and sometimes for the rest of our lives. The hippocampus associates sensory experiences like smells, for example, to memory. And so we smell particular things and it takes us back to maybe when we were at the beach or something like that. We smell, say, salt water or maybe saltwater taffy or something like that, and we think of our time at the beach and it conjures up those memories. Perfume companies take advantage of this, or candle companies where they put all these fragrances into their product so that it evokes memories, pleasant memories. And so we'll associate those memories with that particular candle scent, and then we'll want to buy more of the candles because we like the memories that we associate with those smells. So there's a whole psychological aspect to perfume fragrances and candle fragrances. And also spatial relationships. So, like I mentioned, with the cerebellum assisting with this, the hippocampus is involved in this as well, so that we know how far away something is from us. We're aware of our surroundings, so that we don't bump into things whenever we're walking, for example. Where are they in the brain? So this is a section of the cerebrum, and you can see down in the lower left the amygdala in that region, and then in the lower right the hippocampus. So the amygdala and hippocampus are very close to each other in terms of where they are located within the cerebrum. The Man with No Memory, if you want to follow a fascinating story, there was a British man. His name was Clive Waring. Clive Waring. And if you Google that, you'll find plenty of videos on him. He contracted a virus, which pretty much it must have destroyed his hippocampus and amygdala, or one or the other, or both, where he had no memory whatsoever. The only person he remembered in his life was his wife, but he had no recollection of what he did in his career. He was a conductor, a concert pianist. Now he could still play the piano, so the destruction of his hippocampus and amygdala, that did not affect his ability to play the piano. And as I mentioned before, perhaps that information was stored in his cerebellum. I don't know, but that could have been the case, where his cerebellum was not affected. But he has had the worst case of amnesia ever known. And it's pretty profound. So you can Google Clive Waring. And then a TED Ed video where this young man, he had his hippocampus removed because they thought it would help him function properly. He was taking to seizures, and he couldn't function on a day-to-day basis. And so a neurosurgeon thought, hey, let's remove his hippocampus and let's see what happens. Well, his seizures stopped, but he lost his memory. He couldn't remember how to do things. It's an interesting TED Ed video. And then, of course, as you know, on the internet, you can type in the individual's name, and then you can find all kinds of more information about it. But start with the TED Ed video. It's a good one. Go to TED Ed and then type in their search area, removal of hippocampus, and you'll find that video there. It's an interesting one. Let's look at the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is the extension of the brain stem, and of course it runs down our back and through our vertebrae. The spinal cord itself ends between lumbar 1 and lumbar 2, L1 and L2, and then what happens is it separates and splits apart into this tail-like structure called the cauda equina, which literally means the horse's tail, because it becomes this hair-like structure. And anytime they want to remove any cerebrospinal fluid, like let's say they're checking for meningitis, or they're looking for some kind of pathogen in the central nervous system, they're going to remove cerebrospinal fluid and then examine it under a microscope. Well, where are they going to go to get it without damaging you or causing paralysis? They're always done below L3. And that's the reason why, like I said, because the danger of damaging and causing paralysis is not there whenever you go down below L3, because when the needle goes in to aspirate or draw out some of that cerebrospinal fluid, you're not going to nick the spinal cord and cause permanent damage. So they always go below L3, lumbar number 3. It conducts impulses between the periphery and the CNS. So everything on the outside of us, from our arms and our legs and our appendicular part of our bodies, is coming in through the nerves, the periphery nerves, and then into the spinal cord and heading to the brain. There is a canal called the central canal, which is a long extension of one of the brain ventricles that contains cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And so that ventricle just extends way down the cord, and then that's what contains the cerebrospinal fluid. It too is covered by the 3 meninges, the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia maters, just like the brain is. And it has what are called nerve tracts, ascending going up and descending coming down. So it's like a two-way street, information going from the outside up the cord to the brain, and information coming from the brain down the cord to, say, your arms, because you want to move your arm or something like that. You're you're trying to swing a bat or whatever. So you consciously think, I want to swing this bat, and that information moves from the brain to the cord to your muscles, and then you swing the bat. And the picture there, the one on the left side of the picture, that's part of the vertebrae and cord from a cadaver, so that you can see what the cord actually looks like. This is not at the cauda equina. This is where it's still a solid cord structure. And you can see the dura mater there. About halfway down, you can see the dura mater surface there, and then the cord would be underneath it. The arachnoid mater, yeah, you can see, I can see it because I know where it is, but maybe if you have a trained eye, you can as well. The arachnoid mater is on just above where you can see the dura mater, where it's been cut horizontally. You see that kind of fuzzy web-like area? That's the arachnoid mater. And right there, that's where the cerebrospinal fluid would be found. Then the pia mater, which is very thin and delicate, and you can't really see it. Reflexes in the reflex arc. So reflexes are rapid, predictable, and involuntary responses to stimuli. Rapid, predictable, and involuntary. So they happen lightning fast. They happen predictably every time. The reflex is going to happen the same way. It's not like maybe it's going to happen this way this time and another way, or maybe it's not going to work this time. They're always predictable, and they're involuntary. You think about them. You don't think about them at all. Reflexes and reflex arcs, they involve as few synapses as possible. Now, a synapse, sorry, I didn't discuss that. A synapse is a gap between neurons. So where one neuron meets but does not touch another neuron is called a synapse. Well, they have as few as possible. Why? Well, if there are as few, think about it like if you're driving a car on the road, you come to all these red lights. And then you go, and then you come to another intersection where there's a red light, and then you can go. And that's kind of like what a synapse is. A synapse will slow things down very slightly. And so reflexes, we want to happen very rapidly, like lightning fast. And so there are a few synapses as possible so that the reflex can happen very quickly. Just like if you were driving and there were no red lights or intersections, you could just drive right through and not have to waste time at the intersections and at the red lights. So as few synapses as possible. And you'll notice in this picture of the reflex arc here, where it shows at the upper right, a pin goes into your skin, and then it travels down through what's called a sensory neuron, and then goes through the spinal cord, and then comes out a motor neuron. An organ is missing. Now, of course, there's a lot of organs. You could say the liver, you could say the kidneys, or the stomach. Well, that doesn't make sense. But what nervous system organ is missing from this picture? It's a pretty major nervous system organ. It starts with a B. The brain. There's no brain involved here. So it's involuntary. Remember, this is happening without the brain being involved. And the reason why is because you want to pull your muscle away as quickly as possible from whatever it is. If a pin is jabbing you or something, you're going to pull back as quickly as possible because your sensory neurons are being stimulated so much that this registers as this is a severe situation. We need to take care of this immediately, and the brain doesn't need to be involved. You don't need to think about it. We don't have to comprehend that we're being stuck with a pin or that we have our hand in a fire or something like that. We need to get our body part out of the threat as quickly as possible. And then it will register it because those sensory neurons are still being stimulated because they were burned or they were poked with a pin or a staple or something like that. And so the sensory neurons are still being stimulated. So then the information will go up to the brain and you'll think, oh my gosh, I just had my hand in the fire or I just stapled myself or whatever. I hope you didn't do that. But anyway, those neurons are still being stimulated, and so that information gets sent to the brain, and then you realize what you did. But before you actually realized it, what happened, you had pulled your hand out of the fire, or you had jumped up from whatever you sat on or something like that because the brain wasn't involved. And so by the time you realize what happened, you've already removed yourself from the very painful situation. So we feel pain after we've reacted. We think it's simultaneous, but really it isn't. We pull our, so if you can imagine, let's say you put your hand on a stove that you don't realize is really hot. and it doesn't appear to be hot, but you set your hand down on it, and then you pull your hand away. Well, if we could slow that down frame by frame, and you can imagine a person doing this. They put their hand on the stove. Imagine this with me. And you're taking this picture frame by frame. They pull their hand away, and then you look at their face, and then they realized what happens. It's not like hand being pulled away in face, or the facial expression, or the exclamation of ow, or whatever. The hand is pulled away first, and then in a split second, then the person would say ow, or whatever they would exclaim there. So the pain is felt after you have removed your hand from the burning stove. The peripheral nervous system. So that's the central nervous system completed. This is the peripheral. And we're going to look at the two major divisions of the peripheral, somatic and autonomic. The somatic nervous system controls voluntary movement, and acetylcholine, which is abbreviated capital A, capital C, lowercase h, it's the primary neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that transmit information within the nervous system. This is their means of communication, and there are a number of them, and acetylcholine is one of them, and it's the primary neurotransmitter involved in voluntary movement and voluntary consciousness. It includes all the neurons connected with skeletal muscles, because those are our voluntary ones, connected with our skin, and our sense organs as well. So this is all about what we experience and what we sense, voluntary stuff. Autonomic nervous system, think automatic, controls involuntary movement, like peristalsis, the contraction of smooth muscle in our digestive system, for example, or the smooth muscle of our arteries. That's all controlled by the autonomic nervous system. It maintains homeostasis, and the autonomic is divided into two divisions called the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So let's look at those two. Sympathetic nervous system, this sympathetic division is nicknamed fight or flight. And that's why I have the picture of this dog here. We've got a very aggressive German Shepherd approaching a Springer Spaniel. And that Springer Spaniel, which I'm pretty sure that's a Springer Spaniel, it looks very much like one. I don't think it's going to fight. It looks like it's going to flee. And so you can see the expression on its face like, I'm out of here. So this is the fight or flight response. This is all about energy generation, creating loads of ATP, the energy molecule. It inhibits digestion. And so the blood, the circulation, the blood is diverted from the digestive system and our skin. And so that's why sometimes we look pale when we are in fear, or we want to flee from something, where blood leaves the skin and the digestive system, and it diverts it to muscle tissue and the lungs. So we want to put as much blood to the muscles because we want to contract our skeletal muscles so that we can get out of there quickly, and we want to divert the blood to the lungs so that oxygen can get to our muscles as quickly as possible, and carbon dioxide can be exhaled as quickly as possible. It dilates or opens up our breathing passages so that we can take in as much volume of oxygen as possible and get rid of as much carbon dioxide as possible. It increases our heart rate. It dilates our pupils, so our pupils open up so that we can take in more light and see more of our surroundings and really be able to comprehend what we're dealing with. And the two neurotransmitters that are involved here, and these are also classified as hormones, are norepinephrine and epinephrine. And epinephrine you have heard of as adrenaline, I'm sure. So adrenaline does all of these effects to us. It immediately brings up our heart rate and does all of these effects that I just talked about. So this is fight or flight. And this video link is just a segment from I think it's a National Geographic video they did on fight or flight, the sympathetic division, about running away from things and kicking ourselves into action immediately. Great picture for parasympathetic, a sleeping lion. Parasympathetic division its nickname is rest and digest. So we don't want to fight, we don't want to flee, we just want to take a nap. It increases blood flow to the digestive system. It promotes digestion and absorption. This is when we're in a relaxed state, so our food can be digested properly. And maybe you've experienced this. So maybe you're into sports and they tell you don't eat a large meal before a competitive event, before a track meet or before a basketball game or a swim meet or something like that, because your sympathetic division is going to be very active and it's going to divert blood flow from the digestive system, and this can create problems because you've got this food in your digestive system that is awaiting digestion, but guess what? The blood flow is moved away from there to your muscles and your breathing and your heart and your circulation, and so therefore you're not going to be able to digest food very efficiently, and sometimes you can develop cramps or stomach pains, and that's the reason why. So when you're relaxed, you can digest very easily because the blood can flow to there, and then you can break your food down and get it into your circulation. It constricts uh, breathing passages so that we don't have to, we're not needing to take in loads of oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide because we're in a relaxed state. So our breathing passages, our bronchioles and bronchial tubes constrict. They don't have to open up and dilate like they would if we were in a threatening situation. It slows our heart rate. And the primary neurotransmitter here that creates a lot of these physiological effects is acetylcholine. So acetylcholine slows things down. Okay, so that's the end of part 2 of this 3-part series. So we covered the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and in part 3 we're going to get to supporting cells of the nervous system called glial cells. And so that's what will be coming up in the next segment of this lecture. Hope you enjoyed part 2 and that you're looking forward to part 3, and thank you for watching.